morning, everyone. I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center, and it is my great pleasure to be partnering with LAPOP Lab at Vanderbilt University once again to be able to host a discussion of their really seminal work that takes the pulse of democracy in the Americas. This is a survey that comes out every 2 years that is really a vital resource for all of us in terms of understanding public attitudes towards democracy, towards the rule of law, and the kinds of issues, corruption, gender-based violence that erode support for democracy around the region. So it's my pleasure to introduce first Barbara Feinstein, who is the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID, for some opening remarks. Following Barbara's presentation, we will be joined by Liz Zechmeister and Noam Lupu, the Director and Associate Director, respectively, of the LAPOP project. And then we have two outstanding commentators who, in their own work, have not only followed the course of democracy and democratic governance in the region institutionally, but also personally. First, we'll hear from Adriana Camacho, who is a senior economist and consultant to the United Nations Development Program, which does its own work on democratic governance, as well as Ariel Armani, dear friend, who is the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and Director of the University Center for Global Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the audience. If you would like to put a comment or a question in the chat, please feel free. Special thanks to Mariana Rodriguez of Vanderbilt, who has helped us with this, and she will be putting a link to the report in the chat so you can all download that. Okay, Barbara, on to you.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and thank you all for joining us virtually today. I want to extend special thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center for once again partnering with USAID to host this event. We truly and deeply appreciate our collaboration with the Wilson Center, which I should note long predates the appointment of our former administrator, Mark Green, also a great aficionado of the LAC region, as your CEO. In the face-to-face world, our organizations are linked not only by shared issues of concern, but also by infrastructure and convenience, a short walk through the Ronald Reagan building being the only obstacle to attending each other's events and working together. So it's wonderful that even in this virtual world and virtual space, we're continuing this collaboration. The Center's Latin America program, under the amazing leadership of Cindy Arnson, is an outstanding resource for all of us who closely follow the region and is always at the cutting edge of learning and research. And speaking of the cutting edge of learning and research, I'm very pleased to be sharing the virtual stage today with two world-class researchers on democratic norms and values in the Americas, Liz Zechmeister and Noam Lupu at Vanderbilt University. As you'll hear today, they remain at the vanguard of public opinion research in the region and beyond, with world-class innovations in methodology and technology, combined with a deep expertise in democracy and political theory. I'd like to thank you, Liz and Noam, for your commitment to bridging the gap between academic research and policy. Vanderbilt University has been a long-standing and deeply valued partner of USAID, and we look forward to continuing this collaboration in the coming years. It's also an honor to share this event with Adriana Camacho and Ariel Armani. You've both been long champions for issues impacting democracy in the Latin America and Caribbean region, and your respective research on the region has enriched policy discussions about how to ensure that all people have access to basic human rights and democratic governance. So thank you for being here today, and I look forward to also hearing your thoughts on the presentation. For those of you who are not aware, USAID is the US government agency that delivers development and humanitarian assistance around the world on behalf of the American people. We have missions in 13 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, with programs in Venezuela and Cuba also managed out of Washington, D.C. USAID programs promote citizen-responsive democratic governance in every Latin American country in which we work. In my career at AID, I've had the honor of traveling throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, visiting programs, local activists, meeting with officials, and spending time with citizens who are often undergoing the most difficult of circumstances. And one thing that remains crystal clear throughout this time is that a universal truth, which of course exists throughout all of our time and all of our experiences working on the region's toughest problems in Latin America and in the world, is the fundamental importance of democratic values. Where there is no tolerance, there can be no peace. Where there is no concern for inclusion, there is no justice. And where there is no expectation of accountability, abuse and corruption will reign unchecked. When citizens lose touch with these fundamental democratic norms, we find that this is the most worrisome sign of rough times ahead. Public opinion, norms, and attitudes about basic democratic principles serve as the canary in the coal mine for democracy. At USAID, we support research into not only democratic attitudes, but also citizens' experiences with crime, violence, corruption, and migration, because these numbers matter. Research, data, and evidence are a vital part of AID's approach to promoting democratic governance and to development in general. As an agency, we're a strong believer in the importance of metrics and evidence-based policies to drive decisions about how best to leverage our limited assistance dollars for life-changing impacts. And today, the Americas Barometer regularly surveys more than 20 countries in the Americas, creating a comprehensive comparative democratic portrait of the region. Try this number on for size, 64,362. That is how many surveys the intrepid team at LAPOP carried out as part of the 2021 Americas Barometer. It's beyond impressive. As I'm sure you'll hear about in more detail from Liz and Noam, beyond the sheer scale of the exercise, LAPOP had to completely revamp their approach to the survey to accommodate the realities of the pandemic. LAPOP's commitment to innovation, as well as their drive to build local capacity to carry out world-class public opinion research, ensured that against all odds, the survey would go on. LAPOP is a model for survey organizations across the LAC region and other regional barometers, including the Arab Barometer and the Afro Barometer, and for work by the US Department of State, Pew Research, and others. Every year, Vanderbilt's LAPOP sets the bar higher for data quality and relevance, and every year they sail right over that bar and set a new standard. The impact that the Americas Barometer has had over time goes well beyond the immediate needs of AID and the other donors directly involved. Hundreds of doctoral dissertations have been written using Americas Barometer data, and there are an average of 250 scholarly publications each year that cite project data. While respecting longitudinal data, the barometer also has been responsive to public policy priorities of the moment. For example, LAPOP has worked closely with USAID to build out additional research on intentions to migrate, gender-based violence, and public opinion about the role of China in the region. The research carried out by LAPOP truly represents a public good. The data sets and reports from the Americas Barometer are made freely available and are widely used by researchers around the world. In any given year, project data is downloaded over 20,000 times. USAID is proud to be a supporter of this work, and we're very excited to share the results of the 2021 Americas Barometer with you all today. We look forward to a continued partnership that promotes smart policies, effective programs, and strengthening democracy through rigorous data, learning, and research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Liz, go right ahead.
Yep, jumping right in to say the same thing. Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you, Cindy. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting us, and to USAID and Vanderbilt University as well for their core support for the project. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so give me just a minute to do that. Okay. Noam, will you give me a thumbs up if it's all set? Okay. So today is a capstone event on a long process that involved efforts by hundreds of individuals across the region who worked together to produce the 2021 Americas Barometer. The Americas Barometer, as we just heard, is designed to take the pulse of democracy in the Western Hemisphere And we're thrilled to be here today to present some top-line findings. You can find more in the full report and in the data sets themselves. Today marks the public release of the 2021 report and the data sets. The AmericasBarometer is an extensive scientific survey of the Western Hemisphere with standardized methods, rigorous quality control, and common questions that make it possible to make comparisons across countries and across time. In total, the project includes over 350,000 interviews from nationally representative surveys in 34 countries. The 2021 round surveyed individuals in 22 countries, including the US and Canada. Today, we're focusing on findings from the 20 countries that were surveyed within the Latin America and Caribbean region. In this region, the 2021 round was conducted by phone. We made this decision for the sake of public health and the safety of project interviewers. As Barbara mentioned, that involved transforming our standard face-to-face protocols to a phone-based approach. And that effort involved a lot of experimentation, capacity building, and adaptation. And we're grateful to all of those who engaged in that process with us, including all the survey teams across the region, our student research assistants, and our partners who gave us support and feedback along the way. There are three distinctive features of the phone survey approach that I want to mention. First, these are random digit dial surveys of the mobile phone population in each country. In the LAC region, mobile phone coverage is sufficiently widespread to support this single frame approach to a nationally representative survey. Second, because phone surveys have to be shorter in length, we doubled the total sample size and we used a split sample approach to the questionnaire. That permitted us to ask as many questions as possible. However, it is never possible to include as many questions as we would like, neither in total nor within a split. So researchers working with the data will recognize these limitations, and we appreciate your understanding that while there are benefits to phone surveys, length is not one of them. Third, the data for the 2021 AmericasBarometer in the LAC region are weighted in our data sets so that we can draw inferences about the general population and so that the data can be compared across time to prior years when the surveys were conducted face-to-face. Now, here are the takeaways from today's presentation. In what follows, I'll walk through data on the first 3 points: on the pandemic and its toll in the region, on democratic attitudes that have remained fairly stable at a lower level than we had seen in prior years, and on a preference for voice in politics. I'll then turn the slides over to Noam, who will discuss the findings on doubts in electoral institutions, increased tolerance for centralization of power in the executive office, and attitudes towards the Chinese and US governments. A key goal of the AmericasBarometer is to provide data on the nature of democratic orientations across countries and across time. And when we think about that goal in 2021, it's impossible to imagine taking the pulse of democracy without first considering the toll of the pandemic. So let me share some data on individuals' experiences under this unexpected and severe stress test for democracy in the region and around the world. This first slide shows for a subset of the LAC region countries, the percent of the population with a household member who has had to seek treatment for COVID-19. And as we advance through the slides, please note that you can reference the question wording at the bottom of each data slide. And also note that when we display or talk about region averages, that value represents the average value among the countries in which the question was asked. So here you see that the public health toll has varied across countries in the region. It's been far more extensive in countries such as Ecuador, Brazil, and Peru, compared to, on the other end of the graph, the toll that the pandemic has taken to health in Uruguay and Jamaica. We asked people not only about their experiences in terms of illness, but also the degree to which they're worried about illness in the household. Anxiety affects many aspects of people's political beliefs and political engagement. And so we wanted to tap into how worried individuals are that they or someone in their household will become ill due to COVID. And you can see here on this slide that the countries from the last slide take similar positions, with Brazil registering the most elevated levels of worry and Jamaica the least. In general, anxiety over the pandemic and its health consequences is high. In the average LAC country, 65% of adults are worried about the health of their household. The pandemic has also taken a financial toll on households across the region. Here we show the percent who say that their personal economic situation worsened over the 12 months prior to the survey. Between 2014 and 2019, about 2 in 5 adults reported a worsened economic situation. And that increased significantly to 3 in 5, or 61% in 2021. In a follow-up question that's not shown here, we find that most people blame the pandemic for these losses, which is certainly understandable, but gives us some context. Related, in 2021, we find an increase in food insecurity in the LAC region. In 2021, on average, across the region, 34%, or approximately 1 in 3 adults, reports a food insecure household. In the report, we make connections between this and elevated intentions to emigrate. And there are other consequences as well, of course, for food insecurity that we can talk about in the Q&A. Now let's turn to something different, experiences with street level corruption under the pandemic. Here we see the average rate of experiences with bribe solicitation by the police. And you can see that this rate of experience has held steady over recent years, including into 2021. So on average in the region, about 12% of people report having been asked for a bribe by a police officer in the last year. Not very different from the prior year, 11%, and similar, exactly the same as 2016-17. However, when we look at the percentage of people who report being asked for a bribe by a government employee, we find a striking increase from 6% 2 years ago to 10% today. We can conjecture that this stems from increased interactions with government employees during the pandemic, combined by or driven by greater needs on the part of the public, and also greater financial insecurity on the part of the public workers themselves. Now, we can also look at another aspect of the rule of law under the pandemic. We can look at the realm of crime and insecurity. And here we find somewhat better news on average. In the average LAC country, the percent of the public that experienced crime in the year prior to the survey decreased slightly in 2021. Now, these averages do mask differences across country. So just about every time we show a regional average, there's variation in change over time for the countries, and there's also variation in levels for the countries. In this case, when we talk about change over time and crime victimization, one thing I'll note is that in Honduras, for example, we find that crime victimization reached its highest point in our cross time series in 2021. So while crime ticked down on average in the region, there are countries in which that trend did not occur, and in fact, we see the opposite. On average, though, it appears that a combination of lockdowns and other factors led to some decrease in experiences with crime in the last year in the region. Again, this varies across countries, and it remains an open question whether things overall will revert to a higher level as the region reopens. We find a similar set of dynamics around perceptions of neighborhood insecurity. On average, insecurity decreased at the margins, though it is still quite elevated, with 46% of adults in the average country reporting that they feel unsafe in their neighborhood. So with that set of experiences under the pandemic as backdrop, what do democratic attitudes look like in 2021? The takeaway here is that at the level of opinion, democracy has showed important signs of resilience. Support for and satisfaction with democracy are low in the region, but those attitudes have remained stable. So here on this next slide, you see the average percent of the public who expresses support for democracy across the America's Barometer time series. This is in response to a question that asks about support for democracy in the abstract. The question asks people to consider whether, despite its problems, democracy is the best of all possible political systems. And in the 2016-17 round of the Americas Barometer, we tracked a significant decrease in orientations toward democracy. You can see that the region has yet to recover. In 2021, there's some evidence of a small upward adjustment, but it's at the margins. So the key finding here is twofold. First, there has not been a recovery to levels prior to 2016. And second, despite the devastating toll of the pandemic, support for democracy did not decline further. That suggests that people did not blame democracy for the negative consequences of the pandemic, including some of the negative political dynamics around responses to the pandemic, which is good news. So there's sort of bad news and good news, both in this graph. When we look across countries, at support for democracy, we see significant variation across the region. Variation that runs from a high of 80% of the public in Uruguay expressing support for democracy to a low of 46% in Haiti. In 4 countries, Paraguay, Peru, Honduras, and Haiti, only 1 in 2 or fewer adults expresses support for democracy. We find similar dynamics around satisfaction with democracy. This question asks how satisfied people are with how democracy is working in the country. And you'll see that here that mean values are lower than they are for support for democracy in the abstract, but the cross-time trend is effectively the same. And when we look at countries and how they're arrayed in 2021 on satisfaction with democracy, again, we find Uruguay on the high end and Haiti on the low end, joined by Peru, Colombia, and Chile, countries where less than 30% express satisfaction with how democracy is working. Now, ever since we tracked or recorded that shift in 2016 to overall lower levels of support for and satisfaction with democracy, people have asked us, well, can you tell us what the public does want? To the extent that the public does not want democracy or is discontent with democracy, what is it that they want? In this round, we designed the questionnaire to try to probe into that question. We asked several questions to find an answer to that question. And the answer, we believe, is this: people want a voice in politics. They want to be able to engage with and give input into the politics that affect their daily lives. Now, one way we can see this is in the overwhelming levels of support for direct democracy that we find in the region. That is democracy via referenda, via direct input from the citizens to policy, as opposed to mediated representative democracy run through elected officials. In Colombia, Brazil, Panama, and Jamaica, over 80% of people prefer a system that permits the opportunity to place voice directly into politics. And we can see this preference for voice in responses to another question that we asked in 2021. This question presented people with a trade-off between a system that guarantees a minimum standard of living or, conversely, freedom of expression. And what you can see, again, is that the vast majority in every country is unwilling to trade off freedom of expression. Even in countries where the need for basic services is highly elevated, the majority are unwilling to trade away freedom of expression to make those ends meet. So people want voice in politics, which is something that democracy is supposed to provide primarily through elections. But here people have some doubts, and this is where I'm going to turn it over to Noam.
Thanks, Liz. In keeping with the set of questions that we introduced to probe this issue of what do people want if support for democracy has gone down, we asked a series of questions about evaluations of elections and electoral democracy. And this is where we're seeing a lot of the doubts about democracy. So while we think that the public's voice is expressed in modern democracy through elections, that's precisely where the majority of the region have a lot of concerns. There's sort of several questions that probe at this that look quite similar. This is a trade-off, another one of these trade-off questions that asks whether citizens would prefer the sort of guaranteed basic income and services to electoral democracy, right? Liz has already shown this trade-off with freedom of expression. And here you can see that majorities almost across the entire region, with a couple of exceptions, do say that they would prefer the guarantees of a basic income over the sort of set of institutions that come with electoral democracy, right? And in some cases, 2/3 would prefer that. So here's the set of questions that we introduced asking about evaluations of elections. This is one in which we asked whether people think that the rich never, sometimes, or always are able to buy elections. And you can see this is the proportion who told us that the rich can indeed sometimes or always buy elections. You can see that with the exception of Uruguay, which sort of typically shows up there at the lower end, or at sort of the most positive end of evaluations of elections, there's a lot of skepticism about elections and the ability of the rich to get their results. We see similar skepticism, not quite as high, but still very, very high levels of skepticism about the secrecy of the vote. So here again, the proportion who say that politicians can find out how somebody voted sometimes or always is very high across the region. In fact, it's even quite high in Uruguay and some of the other Southern Cone countries. And then another question asks whether foreign governments can influence elections. And again, high proportions think that foreign governments can sometimes or always influence elections. So there's quite a lot of skepticism about elections and whether they actually yield the kind of results that people might want. There's also a lot of sort of widespread perception that those who do get elected are not actually working in the public interest. So we introduced a question a number of years ago asking the public whether when they think about politicians in their country, how many are involved in corruption. This is the proportion who say that half or all politicians are involved in corruption. And you can see that that has held pretty steady over the rounds where we've asked the question, such that 2/3 across the region in the sort of average country in the region think that corruption is really widespread among the political class. Again, there's variation across the countries, quite a bit of variation. You can see that this perception is much more widespread in countries like Peru, Brazil, Colombia, countries that have had pretty high profile corruption scandals, starting with the Odebrecht scandals a number of years ago, and more recently with the Panama Papers and with vaccines and the like. Less sort of widespread perceptions of political corruption in places like Uruguay and Guyana. We've been asking for a number of years a question about what people's preferences are with regard to alternatives to democracy. And here's one place that sort of pops out in this particular round as a place where the preference for voice really gets turned into or sort of expressed in a way that is less than democratic. So we ask a question about whether in sort of difficult times, it would be justified for the president to close Congress and run the country sort of unilaterally without a legislature. This is something that has been sort of the rate of support for this kind of idea, which we often call executive coups, has been increasing over time since 2012. You can see the trend over time to the point where nearly a third in the average country these days support this idea, right? So the idea of expressing the voice of the public through a strong leader rather than through elected representatives in the legislature. Again, of course, there's variation. Uruguay as typically at the bottom end, and other countries toward the top, like Peru and Haiti and El Salvador in particular, which might be consistent with the kinds of things that we've been seeing done by President Bukele. In fact, we see a sort of notable increase of support for this idea in El Salvador. You can see that here in this slide. From the last time we asked this question in 2018 to this year, an increase in 33 percentage points in support for this idea. So, and of course, something like this has happened in El Salvador, and so this was actually a fairly popular, a sort of bare majority supports the president ruling without Congress. Finally, we want to just present a little bit on this question that Liz mentioned of trust in the Chinese government and trust in the US government, in part because this is something that has been changing over time, we think in sort of interesting ways. So we've seen over time trust in the Chinese government declining across the region. You can see that that decline actually predates the pandemic. We saw that decline already in the 18-19 round, but it has continued. Of course, again, there's variation across the countries, and you can see that Uruguay and Chile and Bolivia, they're at the bottom, and much higher rates of trust in the Chinese government in Haiti and El Salvador and the DR. We also kind of probed what citizens think the influence of China and the US government is in their countries. So you can see on the left-hand side here, a question about how much China influences the country's economy. You can see that many citizens think that China has a lot of economic influence in their country. Then we followed that up with a question that asks whether how they evaluate this influence, whether they think it's negative, positive, or neither. There's not sort of hugely broad agreement on what that fairly high level of influence does, whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing, but it sort of skews in a positive direction. The same set of questions about the political influence of China generate very different results. You can see that there's not as much of a sense that China has a lot of influence in the politics of the countries. And again, the evaluation of what influence it does have is sort of neither positive nor negative, or there's not much agreement there, about a third in each group. We have the same set of questions asking about the US government. And again, here the trends are sort of interesting over time. So we had seen declining trust in the US government for some time, beginning in the 2016-17 round and then continuing in the 2018-19 round. And we saw quite a boost back in trust in the US government this year. Again, variation across the countries. The US government is sort of less widely trusted in the Southern Cone and in Peru and Bolivia, more widely trusted in Guyana, the DR, and Brazil. Again, as the set of questions about influence, and you can see that there's even more consensus that the US has a lot of economic influence in the region, and a bit more agreement that that influence is positive, though again, there's quite a lot of respondents in our samples who think that it's negative or neither positive nor negative. The political influence, again, sort of skews in the direction of having some or a lot of political influence in the region. Again, not much of a broad agreement on whether that influence is positive, negative, or neither, but sort of skews in a positive direction. What's interesting is the comparison between these two. So one thing that we had noted in previous rounds is that while trust in China was declining, trust in the US government was declining even more rapidly. And as we sort of take the difference between trust in one and trust in the other, we would see sort of the balance of trust skewing towards the Chinese government. And that has really shifted between 2018-19 and this year, such that the only country where we ask these questions that sort of skews in the direction of trusting China more is Haiti. In the rest of the region, there's either sort of no difference between the two or quite a bit more trust in the US government relative to the Chinese government. So with that, I just want to mention and thank, of course, as Liz already noted, the Wilson Center, Cindy, our discussants, but also the team behind the scenes here at LAPOP, who you can see here on the slide. As Barbara mentioned, and Liz also, the transition from our sort of typical face-to-face surveys to phone surveys was a tremendous undertaking. And these folks really went above and beyond in sort of helping us provide high quality data even during pandemic times. So they're really doing all this work behind the scenes. Of course, there's a lot more in the report, so I would urge all of you who are interested to go there. There's a great deal more, and we're happy to talk about all the rest of the findings. These are sort of just the top line things.